Good evening, and welcome back to Lullaby Historian. Tonight we begin with how did medieval people sleep in freezing stone castle? So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. How did medieval people sleep in freezing stone castle? The limestone battery, the thermal mass of the keep. To a modern observer, the medieval fortress appears as a monument to frozen discomfort, a giant, hollowed-out block of ice rising from the landscape. However, the master masons who designed these structures understood a fundamental principle of thermal inertia that we have largely forgotten in our age of thin-walled, air-conditioned homes. They viewed the castle not as a drafty shell, but as a massive energy reservoir. The physics of the cold soak. The walls of a primary keep, such as the Tower of London or the massive piles of the Loire Valley, were rarely less than 6 feet thick, sometimes reaching a staggering 15 feet at the base. This density served a purpose beyond military defense. It created a delayed thermal response. During the summer, these gargantuan limestone blocks absorbed the warmth of the sun, pulling the energy deep into the crystalline structure of the rock. As autumn bled into winter, the castle entered what engineers call the cold soak. While the outside air temperature might plummet overnight, the internal temperature of the masonry dropped at a glacial pace. The stones acted like a battery of heat, slowly releasing the energy they had stored months prior. Inhabitants of the interior chambers were shielded by the sharp, immediate spikes of a blizzard by this atmospheric buffer. The stones did not just keep the world out, they kept a consistent, albeit cool, climate in. The mineral respiration. Limestone is porous. It inhales humidity and exhales the chill. To manage this, the builders utilized thermal isolation. They knew that once a room lost its core heat, reclaiming it would take days of constant fires. Therefore, the goal was never heating in the sense of warming the air, but rather radiant maintenance. The interior of the walls was often filled with rubble core, a mixture of broken stone and lime mortar that acted as a primitive form of insulation. This broken internal structure prevented the direct conduction of cold from the exterior face to the interior chamber. It broke the thermal bridge, ensuring that the cold outside had to navigate a labyrinth of air pockets and varying densities before it could leach the warmth from the Lord's bedchamber. The floor as a foundation of warmth. In the Great Hall, where the ceiling might be 30 feet high, the greatest enemy was convective loss. Heat rose immediately to the rafters, leaving the floor a lake of frost. To counter this, the medieval inhabitant turned to the harvest. They layered the flagstones with organic padding, thick mats of dried river rushes, wheat straw, and aromatic herbs. This was not a sign of slovenliness, but a sophisticated insulating carpet. By trapping air within the hollow stems of the straw, they created a barrier between their feet and the mineral heat sink of the floor. This layer prevented the body's warmth from being sucked out through the soles of the shoes, allowing people to stand in a room that was objectively cold while maintaining a subjective sense of comfort. The architecture of the pocket. Medieval life was a series of spatial contractions. As the sun set and the mercury dropped, the inhabitants did not try to exist in the entirety of the castle. They retreated into micro-environments.
Builders designed small wall chambers and alcoves, essentially hollowed out sections of the massive exterior walls. These tiny rooms required very little energy to reach a livable temperature. The heat of a single candle and 2 human bodies could raise the temperature of a stone alcove by several degrees in an hour. By living in these nests of masonry, the medieval population bypassed the impossible task of warming the vast vaulted galleries, choosing instead to inhabit the radiant margin where the stone was at its thickest and most protective.
The tapestry membrane, weaving an internal skin. If the limestone walls were the castle's ironclad armor, the tapestries were its soft, insulating fleece. In the high winter of the 13th century, a bare stone wall was more than just an aesthetic void. It was a radiant predator. Even with a fire roaring in the hearth, an unadorned masonry surface would continue to absorb the room's energy, drawing warmth away from the skin through a process of thermal siphonage. To combat this, the medieval aristocracy developed a secondary interior architecture, a textile barrier that served as a biological shield against the mineral world. The physics of the air gap. The primary function of a great hanging was the creation of stagnant air. When a heavy wool tapestry was suspended from a wooden cleat an inch or 2 away from the masonry, it established a dead air zone. This narrow pocket functioned exactly like the gap in a modern double-paned window. Because the air trapped behind the fabric could not circulate, it became a stagnant layer of insulation. The stone wall might be freezing to the touch, but the tapestry remained at room temperature. This prevented the convective draughts that typically occur when warm air hits a cold surface, cools rapidly, and sinks to the floor, creating those phantom breezes that haunt old buildings. By clothing the room in wool, the inhabitants effectively stopped the wall from breathing its chill into the living space. For the person sitting near the wall, the tapestry replaced the icy bite of the limestone with the neutral radiance of the fabric. The loom as a thermal factory. The production of these hangings was an industrial necessity. In the centres of Arras and Flanders, weavers worked with heavy-gauge wool to create a material of immense density. These were not flimsy curtains. A single chamber hanging could weigh over 100 pounds. This weight was crucial for structural integrity. A thick, heavy textile did not sway in the minor drafts of a keep. It sat like a solid pavement against the air. The fibers themselves, predominantly sheep's wool, possess a unique molecular resilience. Wool can absorb up to 30% of its weight in moisture without feeling damp. In the humid, foggy winters of northern Europe, the tapestries acted as atmospheric regulators, sucking the excess moisture out of the castle air. This was vital because dry cold is much easier for the human body to endure than damp cold. By keeping the air dry, the tapestries ensured that the warmth from the hearth was more effective, preventing that bone-deep shiver that comes from saturated, frigid air. The sensory barrier, sound and light. Beyond the thermal benefits, the membrane of wool served a physiological purpose. A stone castle is an acoustic nightmare. Sounds of clanking iron, barking hounds, and whistling winds echo endlessly off the hard surfaces. This acoustic chaos can make the environment feel colder and more hostile. Tapestries acted as sound dampeners, swallowing the echoes and creating a muffled sanctuary. This softening of the environment allowed for a deeper, more restorative sleep. When the household retired, the tapestries absorbed the ambient noise of the night watch and the shifting of the fire. Furthermore, these textiles served as the final barrier against light. In an era where the rising sun or a flickering torch could disrupt the circadian rhythm, the dense weave of the wool ensured absolute obscurity. The Lord's chamber became a woven vault, a place where the senses were shielded as much as the skin. The winter migration of the hangings. Warmth in the castle was fluid and mobile. In the summer, these heavy woolens were often taken down and stored in cedar chests to prevent moth damage and to allow the cool stones to lower the interior temperature. The arrival of the winter skin was a ritualistic event. As the first frost silvered the battlements, the household staff would begin the Great Draping. They didn't just hang scenes of hunts or biblical stories on the walls, they used textiles to redefine the space. They would hang tapestries across the center of large halls to create temporary thermal zones, effectively cutting a massive, unheatable gallery into a series of smaller, cozy fabric cubes. This mobile architecture allowed the inhabitants to adjust the castle's volume to match the available fuel. They weren't just living in a building, they were living inside a customized textile shell that expanded and contracted with the seasons. The legend of the warm surface. To the touch, a tapestry in winter was a gentle revelation. If one were to lean against the stone, the body's heat would be sapped instantly, leading to a conductive shock. Leaning against a tapestry, however, felt neutral. The wool didn't try to take anything from the person. This thermal passivity was the secret to medieval comfort. In the bedchamber, this was taken to the extreme. Not only were the walls covered, but the bed itself was enclosed in wadmal or velvet curtains. This created a room within a room within a room. By the time the lord or lady climbed into the high mattress, they were separated from the limestone reality of the castle by 3 distinct layers of air and 4 layers of textile. They slept in a biothermal envelope, where the only heat source required was the steady, quiet metabolism of the sleeper. The castle could freeze, the moat could turn to solid ice, and the hounds in the courtyard could huddle in the straw, but inside the tapestry membrane, the temperature remained a steady, soft, and hospitable constant. The Great Hall's respiration, the centralized hearth. If the limestone walls were the castle's shell and the tapestries its skin, the central hearth was its atmospheric heart. In the sprawling expanse of a medieval great hall, the fireplace was not merely a decorative feature. It was a complex thermal engine that governed the survival of the entire household. Managing this fire was a discipline of combustion economy, a process of breathing life into the building during the day and carefully throttling that energy as the residents moved toward the deep, silent hours of rest. The physics of the open hearth. In the early medieval period, the fire sat in the middle of the floor on a raised stone dais. This open center geometry allowed for a 360-degree radiation of heat. Unlike a modern fireplace tucked into a wall, which loses significant energy to the masonry behind it, the central hearth utilized direct radial transfer. Every ember contributed its warmth to the surrounding air. The respiration of the hall depended on the stack effect. As the fire burned, the heated air became less dense and rose toward the high timbered ceiling. There, it pooled in the rafters, creating a warm air reservoir that acted as a ceiling-level thermal blanket. The smoke would eventually exit through a louver, a slatted wooden vent in the roof designed to let smoke out while keeping rain and snow from falling directly onto the flames. This vertical movement of air ensured a constant, gentle circulation, preventing the air at the floor from becoming completely stagnant and frigid. The anatomy of the fuel. Staying warm was an industrial logistics challenge. A great hall could consume several tons of wood over a particularly brutal winter. The choice of fuel was a science of density. Hardwoods like oak and beech were the long burn assets. These woods possess a high energy-to-volume ratio, meaning they produce a steady, intense heat that lasts for hours. For the American reader, envisioning this requires a shift from convenience to calibration.
The fire tender, or valet de feu, didn't just throw logs onto a pile, they built the fire in stages of ignition. Fast-burning softwoods like pine were used for thermal recovery, quickly raising the temperature of the hall after a cold night. Once the core temperature was stabilized, the massive oak rounds were introduced to provide the steady-state warmth required for the evening's activities. The scent was a thick, comforting blend of resin, dry earth, and the faint, sweet aroma of curing meat hanging in the upper galleries. The banking of the coals, the midnight stasis. As the household prepared for sleep, the fire tending entered its most critical phase, the couvre-feu, from which we get the word curfew. This was the rhythmic damping of the flames. The goal was not to let the fire burn out, but to bank it. The fire tender would pull the unburnt logs to the sides and gather the glowing embers into a compact mound in the center. These coals were then covered with a layer of ash or a specialized ceramic or metal lid called a curfew. This oxygen restriction ensured that the coals would smolder at a very low temperature throughout the night. By throttling the combustion, the castle saved precious fuel while ensuring that a deep core of heat remained. In the morning, a simple stir of the embers and a handful of dry kindling would restore the fire instantly, bypassing the high energy cost of starting a blaze from frozen stone. The thermal stratification of the household. As the fire was banked, the social geography of the hall shifted. Heat in the medieval world was tiered. Because the warmest air rose to the rafters, the sleeping arrangements followed this vertical gradient. The highest-ranking members of the household often slept in solar chambers or galleries positioned higher up in the architecture, where they could tap into the pooled warmth lingering near the ceiling. The servants and guards remained on the floor, utilizing the residual radiance of the hearthstones. This stone dais, often 3 or 4 inches thick, acted as a thermal sink. Long after the flames had been dimmed, the stones continued to pulse with heat, providing a conductive comfort to those lying nearby on pallets of straw. The chimney revolution and radiant efficiency. By the later medieval period, the central hearth began to migrate to the walls as the wall-mounted chimney was perfected. This was a revolution in thermal management. The fireplace was now built with a fire back, a heavy iron or stone plate behind the logs. This plate was a radiant mirror. As the fire burned, the fire back would absorb intense heat and reflected forward into the room. Even after the fire had been banked for the night, the iron fireback would continue to glow with an invisible infrared warmth for hours. This ensured that the bed zone, directly in front of the fireplace, remained several degrees warmer than the rest of the chamber. The chimney also improved the atmospheric purity of the castle, creating a stronger updraft that pulled cold air across the floor and away from the sleepers, while whisking smoke out with surgical precision. The breath of the building. To live in a castle was to live within a breathing organism. The great hall's respiration, the rising of the heat, the banking of the coals, and the radiant pulse of the masonry was the daily metronome of life. It was a boring history of calibrated survival, where every log was a unit of time and every ember was a promise of a morning. When the inhabitants finally closed their eyes, they weren't just in a room, they were part of a balanced thermal ecosystem. The air was still, the stones were charged with the day's fire, and the banked coals sat like a sleeping sun beneath the ash. The cold soak of the exterior was held at bay by this internal combustion, turning the freezing limestone keep into a massive living battery that sustained the huddle of humanity within its walls.
The reed and rush meadow. Natural insulation underfoot. While the tapestries shielded the skin from the walls and the hearth warmed the air, the most persistent threat to medieval comfort lay beneath the soles of the feet. In a stone castle, the floor is the ultimate heat thief. Large flagstones or packed earth serve as a constant thermal drain,
pulling caloric energy directly from the human body through the process of conduction. To combat this, medieval society didn't just clean their floors, they engineered them. The result was a thick, fragrant, and highly effective organic carpet known as the rush strewing. The physics of the fibrous barrier. Stone is an exceptional conductor of cold. Without an intervening layer, a person standing on a limestone floor is effectively tethered to the bedrock. To break this connection, the medieval household utilized cellular air traps. Rushes, straw, and hay are composed of hollow tubes. When layered inches thick across a great hall, these tubes create millions of micro pockets of dead air. This is the principle of loft, similar to how a modern down jacket or fiberglass insulation works. By trapping the air within the fibrous mass, the rushes prevented the warmth of the room from ever reaching the cold stone below. Instead of a heat sink, the floor became a thermal buffer. For the American reader, this represents a transition from a hard surface reality to a textural landscape, where the floor was a living, breathing component of the home's insulation. The harvest of the marsh, material selection. The resilience of the floor depended on the quality of the material. The most prized plant was the sweet flag, or the common bulrush. These plants were harvested from riverbanks and marshes, dried until they were supple but tough, and then transported to the castle in massive bundles. Unlike straw, which can be brittle and dusty, rushes are waxy and durable. They possessed a mechanical springiness that could withstand the constant traffic of heavy leather boots, hunting dogs, and the dragging of oak furniture. This elasticity was crucial. A flattened floor is a failed insulator. By maintaining its volume, the rush strewing ensured that the dead air zone remained intact throughout the winter. The scent of a freshly strewn floor was a botanical symphony, a sharp green aroma that signaled the biotic vitality of the household. The aromatic layering, sensory and sanitary management. A medieval floor was a multi-sensory archive. Because the rushes were not changed every day, they were layered with antimicrobial herbs. This was a biochemical defense against the inevitable accumulation of debris. Housewives and stewards would scatter handfuls of lavender, tansy, meadowsweet, and mint into the rushes. When people walked across the floor, their weight would rhythmically crush the herbs, releasing essential oils into the air. This wasn't just for fragrance. Many of these plants served as natural repellents for fleas, lice, and flies. It turned the floor into a scented battery where every footfall contributed to the atmospheric hygiene of the room. This layering created a secondary metabolism for the castle, where the floor helped process the odors of a crowded indoor life. The winter thickening, the seasonal accretion. As the temperature dropped, the depth of the meadow increased. In the height of summer, a thin layer of rushes was sufficient for cleanliness, but in the deep freeze of January, the floor underwent a thermal augmentation. New layers were added on top of the old, creating a mat of insulation that could be several inches thick. This accretion of fiber meant that the floor became physically soft. The sound of the castle changed. The clatter of the hall was replaced by a muffled hush. This acoustic softening was an essential part of the winter experience. It reduced the perceived cold by removing the sharp, echoing sounds associated with frozen stone. The floor became a tactile sanctuary, a place where children could play and dogs could sleep without ever touching the icy reality of the masonry. The metabolism of the waste. The boring history of the medieval floor is often misunderstood as a sign of filth. However, the internal life of the rushes was a slow-motion recycling system. While it is true that bones and scraps from the table might find their way into the depths, the dry, alkaline nature of the straw and the antimicrobial herbs helped to mummify organic waste. Eventually, the entire floor would be stripped. This was a massive communal effort where the old, compacted meadow was raked up and carried out to the gardens or the fields. This was a nutrient loop. The floor of the castle became the fertilizer for the next spring's crops. This cyclical maintenance ensured that the biological insulation was never permanent but always renewable.
The sleep of the hearthside. For those sleeping in the Great Hall, guards, travelers, and lower status servants, the reed meadow was their mattress. They did not lie on the stone, they lay on the thermal protection of the rushes. By placing a wool cloak or a simple sheepskin over the thick mat of straw, they could tap into the residual heat of the hearth while remaining insulated from the sovereign cold of the earth. This low-level living was a strategic choice. By staying within the warm air pool near the floor's insulation and the banked coals, the sleepers survived the nights that would have frozen a man to death on bare granite. The reed and rush meadow was the final layer of the cocoon, a vegetable shield that turned a cold mineral fortress into a hospitable bioshelter. As the wind howled through the battlements, the inhabitants rested on a fabric of the marsh, a soft, fragrant, and insulating foundation that held the great stasis of the winter at bay. The solar retreat, the architecture of the alcove. If the Great Hall was the civic lung of the castle, vast, airy, and difficult to regulate, the solar was its thermal sanctuary. As the medieval winter intensified, the inhabitants engaged in a strategic spatial contraction. They recognized that heating a volume of air 30 feet high was a fool's errand. Instead, they moved their lives into the architecture of the pocket. The solar, or the private withdrawing room, was the ultimate heat trap, designed to leverage the biological radiance of a small group of people within a highly insulated, wood-paneled nest. The physics of volumetric reduction. The primary enemy of warmth is excess volume. In a large hall, the heat from a fire dissipates rapidly as it rises into the rafters, leaving the human-occupied zone cold. The solar solved this through geometric scaling. These rooms were designed with lower ceilings and smaller floor plans. By reducing the cubic footage of the environment, the Norse or Frankish lord ensured that every calorie of energy produced by a small fireplace, or even the collective metabolic output of several people, had a measurable impact on the air temperature. This was microclimate management. In the American context, it is the difference between trying to heat a warehouse and heating a walk-in closet. The solar was an atmospheric container. Because the room was small, the air could be charged with heat quickly. Once the room reached a comfortable temperature, the thick walls and thermal barriers ensured that the rate of loss was significantly slowed, creating a stable, warm interior horizon that could be maintained with a fraction of the fuel used in the hall below. The timber lining, breaking the mineral connection. The most significant innovation within the solar was the transition from stone face to timber lining. While the exterior walls remained massive limestone, the interior was often encased in oak or pine paneling, known as wainscoting. This was a thermal divorce from the bedrock. Wood has much lower thermal conductivity than stone, while limestone acts as a heat sponge, constantly sucking energy out of the room. Wood acts as a reflector. The wooden panels felt warm to the touch because they did not leach heat from the skin as rapidly as masonry. Furthermore, the installation of wainscoting created another dead air gap between the wood and the stone. This composite wall functioned as a medieval form of rigid foam insulation, ensuring that the radiant cold of the castle's core never made contact with the room's atmosphere. The nesting instinct, the alcove and the wall chamber. Within the solar itself, there was a further nesting of space. Medieval builders often carved wall chambers directly into the thickness of the masonry. These were essentially holes in the fortress, but when lined with furs and cushions, they became the ultimate biothermal pods. These alcoves served as reading nooks or sleeping niches. By sitting inside the wall, the inhabitant was surrounded by three sides by thermal mass that had been warmed by the room's air.
This created a cocoon effect, where the radiant symmetry of the small space reflected the body's own heat back upon itself. It was the manual optimization of comfort, a realization that the most efficient way to stay warm was to occupy the smallest possible structural void. The looming furniture, the bed as a building. The ultimate expression of the solar retreat was the bed. In the medieval mind, a bed was not just a piece of furniture, it was a self-contained architecture. The four-poster bed with its celestial canopy and heavy velvet curtains was a room within a room. When the curtains were drawn, the volume of air to be heated was reduced from that of a room to that of a large box. The occupant's own breath and body pulse would raise the temperature inside the bed curtains by 10 to 15 degrees in a matter of minutes. This was biological autonomy. The castle could be freezing, the solar could be chilly, but the bed environment remained a tropical microzone. This layered enclosure ensured that the history of sleep was of protected stasis, where the mineral reality of the castle was rhythmically excluded by layers of oak, wool, and linen.
The social heat, the communal withdrawal. The solar was also the site of social compression. Privacy, in the modern sense, was a thermal liability. In the deep winter, the lord, his family, and high-ranking attendants would gather in the solar to share the shared radiance. This was the physics of the huddle. By concentrating the biological energy of 10 people into a room designed for 5, they created a shared metabolism. The sound of the solar was intimate and muffled, the hiss of a small fire, the soft murmur of conversation, and the rustle of silk and fur. This communal living was a strategic response to the astringent cold. They were pooling their heat, turning the social unit into a heat-generating organism. The preservation of the light. Finally, the solar was a sanctuary of light. Because the room was small and wood-lined, a few tallow candles or a single soapstone lamp could illuminate the entire space. This visual warmth had a profound effect on the perceived temperature. A well-lit room feels warmer than a dark one. The luminous density of the solar, the light reflecting off the polished oak and the gold-threaded tapestries, created an aesthetic of comfort. The inhabitants weren't just surviving the stone, they were refining the dark. The solar was the final bastion of the medieval home, a rhythmic retreat into a world of wood and fabric where the great stasis of the winter was held at bay by the passive engineering of the alcove and the quiet radiance of the human huddle. The celestial bed, the sovereign survival pod. If the castle was the fortress and the solar was the sanctuary, the medieval bed was the final citadel. In an era where centralized climate control was a physical impossibility, the four-poster bed, often referred to as a celestial bed due to its overhead canopy, functioned as a sophisticated piece of micro-environmental engineering. It was not merely a place for rest, it was a self-contained thermal laboratory designed to harvest and preserve the biological energy of the sleeper against the encroaching mineral zero of the night. The physics of the triple enclosure. To understand the warmth of a medieval bed, one must view it as a series of atmospheric filters. The sleeper was not simply lying in a room, they were encased in a matryoshka doll of insulation. The first layer was the room itself, the solar. The second was the bed's heavy wooden frame, and the third was the textile envelope created by the curtains. This triple enclosure utilized the principle of volumetric capture. A standard bedchamber might contain 3,000 cubic feet of air, but the interior of a draped bed contained less than 100. By restricting the volume, the occupants ensured that their own metabolic heat, the steady 37 degrees Celsius output of the human body, would rapidly warm the surrounding air. Within 20 minutes of drawing the curtains, the temperature inside the bed could rise significantly above the ambient temperature of the room.
The bed was a passive heat pump, using the sleeper as the fuel source to create a tropical microzone in the heart of a frozen keep. The anatomy of the mattress, the layered foundation. The thermal integrity of the bed began at the base. Lying on a simple wooden board would lead to conductive drain, where the cold of the floor is pulled through the bedposts and into the sleeper's back. To break this connection, the medieval bed was a masterclass in stratified softness. The rope lattice. The foundation was often a network of tensioned hemp ropes. This created an airy suspension that kept the bedding off the solid wood, providing a primary layer of dead air insulation. The straw paillasse, a thick, coarse mattress filled with dried straw or seagrass, served as the structural buffer. This layer provided the loft necessary to trap heat and provide a barrier against rising damp. The feather tick. The final layer was a massive bag filled with down or goose feathers. For the American reader, this is the medieval version of a high fill power sleeping bag. Feathers are multi-dimensional traps for air. They create a heat reservoir that molds to the body, ensuring no thermal voids remain where cold air could settle. The velvet barrier, managing the vapor and the heat. The curtains of the bed, often made of heavy wool, velvet, or thick linen, were the mechanical regulators of the environment. These were not decorative accents, they were atmospheric valves. When fully closed, they stopped convective loops. In a cold room, warm air near the body rises, and cold air rushes in to replace it, creating a draft cycle. The bed curtains acted as a shield, breaking this cycle and keeping the warmed air in situ. However, a perfectly sealed box would become stifling and damp. The science of the curtain involved a manual calibration of the gap. By leaving a small ventilation sliver at the top or bottom, the sleeper could regulate the oxygen to moisture ratio. The scent of the bed was a complex atmospheric profile, the scent of clean linen, goose down, and the faint musky warmth of the body. This was the acoustic and olfactory proof of safety. The muffled sound of the wind outside the curtains only emphasized the stillness of the interior.
The bed warming ritual, pre-charging the pod. Because the cold soak of the blankets could be daunting, the medieval household utilized external thermal transfer. This was the ritual of the pre-charge. Before the lord or lady retired, a servant would pass a warming pan, a brass or copper vessel filled with glowing hearth coals between the sheets. This was forced convection. The hot metal would drive the moisture out of the linen and charge the feathers with energy. This ensured that the sleeper didn't have to waste their own internal glucose to warm up the cold bedding. Instead, they stepped into a predetermined climate. The bed was primed, allowing the body to enter a state of immediate relaxation rather than thermal stress. The rhythmic sibilance of the warming pan sliding across the sheets was the sonic signal that the great stasis of the night had been successfully managed. The communal furnace, the social physics of the mattress. In the medieval world, the bed was often a collective effort. Privacy was a caloric luxury few could afford. For much of the population, the bed was a shared resource. 2, 3, or even 4 people might share a single large mattress. This was the physics of the huddle taken to its logical conclusion. By pooling biological radiance, the group created a superorganism of heat. The surface area to volume ratio was optimized. With bodies pressed together, there was less exposed skin to lose heat to the air. This social heat was the primary defense for servants and children. To sleep alone was to risk the chill. To sleep together was to guarantee the morning. The infinite history of the medieval night is one of entwined breathing, where the rhythmic pulse of the huddle was the only metronome of survival.
the celestial guard, closing the weave. As the final candle was snuffed and the last curtain was pinned shut, the occupant of the celestial bed was no longer in the castle. They were in a textile universe, a sovereign pod of warmth and obscurity. The mineral reality of the limestone walls, the astringent draughts of the spiral stairs, and the howling void of the winter sky were all rhythmically redacted. The bed was the final victory over the environment. It turned the passive engineering of the castle into a proactive tool for life. Inside the curtains, the great stasis was a state of perfect, toasty suspension. The infinite loom had woven a cradle of heat, a skeletal and fibrous shield that allowed the medieval mind to drift into dreams of spring, while the absolute zero of the world outside was held at bay by a velvet latch and a heartbeat of feathers. The linen layers, engineering the medieval wardrobe. In the modern world, we conceive of warmth as an environmental setting, a number on a thermostat that adjusts the air around us. In the medieval castle, warmth was not a setting, it was a personal architecture. Because the masonry of the keep was a constant thermal sink, the inhabitants had to carry their climate with them. This was achieved by a sophisticated sartorial stratification, a system of layering that functioned as a mobile insulation envelope. For the castle dweller, the wardrobe was the primary line of defense, a biological shell that utilized the specific properties of flax, wool, and fur to manage the body's caloric economy. The prime directive, the linen foundation. The journey into the sartorial cocoon began with the chemise or smock. This was the base layer membrane, typically fashioned from bleached linen. Linen, derived from the flax plant, was chosen for its hygroscopic intelligence. In the humid and closed environment of a winter castle, the human body continues to release moisture through insensible perspiration. If this moisture is allowed to settle against the skin, it creates a conductive bridge that pulls heat away from the body with lethal efficiency. Linen, however, wicks this moisture away, acting as a regulatory surface. It felt crisp and neutral against the skin, ensuring that the primary layer remained dry. This was the foundation of the microclimate. By keeping the skin dry, the linen layer ensured that the subsequent air-trapping layers could function at peak efficiency. The woolen engine, the core of the huddle. Over the linen base came the coat or tunic, and often a secondary overcoat. These were the thermal engines of the outfit, constructed from heavy-weight wool. Wool is a molecular masterpiece of insulation. Each wool fiber is naturally crimped, creating a three-dimensional matrix that traps vast quantities of dead air. This is the principle of thermal resistance. The wool didn't warm the person, it arrested the loss of the body's own radiation. A high-quality woolen tunic functioned as a sponge for heat, holding on to the energy generated by the heart and lungs and creating a warm air pool around the torso. Because wool is naturally fire-resistant, an essential trait in a world lit by tallow and heated by open embers, it was the standard armor of the winter. For the inhabitant, the weight of the wool was a tactile comfort, a physical manifestation of the history of the huddle.
The geometry of the hose, protecting the extremities. The medieval leg was not forgotten in this thermal calculus. The use of hose, individual leg coverings tied to a belt or brace, allowed for localized insulation. These were often made of tailored wool, cut on the bias to ensure a snug fit that followed the contours of the muscle. This tight fit was strategic. By minimizing the air gap between the fabric and the skin in the extremities, the wearer prevented convective cooling. The legs, being far from the metabolic core, are prone to rapid heat loss. The wool hose functioned as thermal sleeves, preserving the blood warmth as it traveled to the feet. Over these, thick wool pedules or socks were worn, creating a fibrous cushion inside leather shoes that were often stuffed with extra hay or moss for emergency insulation. The fur lining, the elite thermal shield. For the aristocracy, the ultimate caloric guard was fur. While wool was the public defense, fur was the private luxury of the huddle. Fur is the superior insulator of the natural world because it combines a dense underfleece with outer guard hairs, creating a dual-phase air trap. The pelisse, or fur-lined mantle, was a wearable fortress. When a lord donned a cloak lined with squirrel, bear, ermine, or fox, they were layering a second metabolism over their own. The fur was worn pelt inward, allowing the soft fibers to interlock with the woolen tunic. This created a structural labyrinth for air, making it nearly impossible for the astringent drafts of the spiral staircase to penetrate to the skin. The scent of the mantle, a mixture of dried animal oils, cedar chests, and wood smoke, was the acoustic and olfactory proof of status and survival. The headgear habit, sealing the chimney. Medieval people possessed a sartorial awareness of the stack effect. They understood that the human body acts like a thermal chimney, with heat rising and escaping through the head and neck. To prevent this caloric leak, the wardrobe was capped with the coif and the hood. The linen coif was the night and day constant, a tight-fitting cap that sealed the scalp. Over this, the wool hood, chaperone, covered the neck and shoulders. This overlapping seal ensured that the warm air pool trapped within the tunic couldn't escape through the collar. By capping the system, the medieval person completed their personal enclosure. They were no longer an exposed organism at the mercy of the limestone reality of the castle. They were a mobile, insulated unit. The sartorial stasis, living in the layers. In the deep winter, these layers were rarely removed. The history of the wardrobe was one of incremental addition. As the sun set and the cold soak of the masonry intensified, a person might add a third tunic or a secondary cloak. This sartorial weight dictated the rhythmic movement of the household, a slow, deliberate grace necessitated by the bulk of the insulation. When the castle dweller finally climbed into their celestial bed, they didn't strip to the skin. They remained in their linen membrane and often their woolen coif, carrying the personal heat they had cultivated all day into the feathered sanctuary of the mattress. The wardrobe and the bed were interlocking systems, two frictionless layers of the same survival strategy. The infinite history of the medieval winter is written in the weave of the cloth and the density of the fur, a manual of protection that turned the freezing stone keep into a hospitable human landscape, where warmth was not something you found, but something you wore.
The canine furnace, biological heat sources. In the modern era, we categorize our pets as companions, but in the medieval castle, the animal kingdom was a vital component of the thermal infrastructure. Beyond the stone walls and wool hangings, the inhabitants relied on a metabolic alliance with the creatures that shared their living space. This was the era of the biological heater, where the high body temperatures of dogs, horses, and livestock were strategically utilized to supplement the failing radiance of the hearth. For the castle resident, a dog was not just a hunter or a guard, it was a mobile heat generator, a furry furnace that could be deployed to the coldest corners of the keep. The lapdog, the portable hand warmer. While large hounds patrolled the Great Hall, a specific class of thermal specialty emerged among the aristocracy, the bred-to-huddle lapdog. These small canines, often ancestors of the Spaniel or the Maltese, were the medieval equivalent of a rechargeable heat pack. These animals were carried in the voluminous sleeves of silk gowns or held in the lap during long sedentary hours of embroidery or council meetings. Their function was localized caloric transfer. By holding a dog against the abdomen or chest, the metabolic core of the human, the owner utilized the dog's excessive pulse to maintain their own temperature. This was a symmetric exchange. The dog enjoyed the human's shelter, and the human enjoyed the dog's radiant output. This canine symbiosis allowed the elite to remain relatively comfortable in the astringent drafts of the solar without needing to sit directly in the smoke of the fire. The stable's respiration, the floor-warming horses. In many castle designs, the architecture of the stables was not an accidental byproduct, but a thermal strategy. Stables were frequently located on the ground floor or directly adjacent to the living quarters. A single horse weighing over 1,000 pounds is a massive thermal engine, breathing out gallons of warm air and radiating immense heat through its hide. The respiration of the stable created a rising plume of warmth. Because heat naturally ascends, the presence of 20 or 30 horses in the lower chambers acted as a biological floor heater for the rooms above. The smell of the stable, the scent of dry hay, warm leather, and equine sweat was a sensory signal of security. For the servants sleeping in the galleries above the stalls, the horses were their radiant foundation. The rhythmic stomp of a hoof and the low whinny of a mare were the acoustic proof that the heat source was still active, providing a conductive comfort through the wooden floorboards. The hound huddle, the social physics of the Great Hall. In the Great Hall, where the limestone reality was at its most aggressive, the hound huddle was the primary defense for the lower household. Dogs were allowed, and indeed encouraged, to sleep among the reed and rush meadow of the floor. This created a composite insulation layer. A servant lying down for the night would not just wrap themselves in a cloak, they would interleave themselves with the hounds. This was the biology of the pack. By pressing against the flank of a large greyhound, the human sleeper tapped into the deep tissue heat of the animal. The dogs, in turn, benefited from the atmospheric protection of the human's cloak. This interspecies huddle was a fluid energy grid, where the collective pulse of 20 humans and 30 dogs created a shared bioclimate that defied the cold soak of the flagstones. The turnspit metabolism applied kinetic heat. In the kitchens, the canine furnace was put to industrial use. The turnspit dog, a now extinct breed with long bodies and short, sturdy legs, was used to power the roasting jacks. While this was a mechanical task, it had a thermal side effect. As the dog ran inside the wooden wheel, its muscular exertion generated significant internal heat. As the dog worked, its high metabolic output contributed to the ambient warmth of the kitchen. After its shift, the working dog was often brought into the main living areas to serve as a preheated bed warmer. The history of the kitchen is one of biological conversion, where the energy of the dog on the wheel was transformed into the radiant comfort of the evening meal and the post-work glow that warmed the servants' quarters. The final guard, the heartbeat in the dark. As the celestial bed was sealed and the tapestry membrane blocked the moon, the final layer of the cocoon was often a dog tucked at the foot of the mattress. This was the final caloric latch. The dog served as a live monitor of the environment. Its sensitive respiration could detect the atmospheric shift of a failing fire or an open shutter.
More importantly, the steady, rhythmic heartbeat of the dog provided an acoustic anchor for the sleeper. In the absolute obscurity of the medieval night, the warm weight of a canine at the feet was a tactile assurance of life. The infinite history of the castle winter is not just a story of stone and wood, but a tale of shared biology. The canine furnace was the fluid link in the survival chain, a living, breathing battery that converted the scraps of the table into the radiant pulse of the bed, ensuring that the great stasis of the cold never reached the human heart. The hot stone ritual, transferring the hearth to the sheets. If the canine furnace was a living source of warmth, the hot stone ritual was its inorganic, engineered counterpart. In the hierarchy of medieval comfort, the goal was the displacement of energy, moving the fierce, localized heat of the central hearth into the distant, frozen microclimates of the sleeping quarters. This was a manual calibration of temperature, a process that relied on the physical properties of thermal retention. For the American reader, this is the ultimate low-tech solution, a study in how common river stones and clay vessels became the rechargeable batteries of the medieval night. The foundation of this ritual lay in the specific heat capacity of dense materials. While wood burns away and air cools instantly, certain stones, specifically basalt, granite, and soapstone, possess the ability to absorb and hold massive amounts of infrared energy. The household staff would select smooth, water-worn stones from the nearby riverbeds. These stones were chosen for their structural integrity. A cracked stone might explode when heated, but a solid river-polished granite orb was a perfect thermal container. Throughout the evening, these stones were nestled at the perimeter of the fire, not in the direct flame, but in the radiant margin of the embers. Over several hours, the stones underwent a slow-motion saturation, absorbing heat until they were vibrating with energy. The soapstone advantage, the eternal warmth. Soapstone, or steatite, is a metamorphic miracle. It is soft enough to be carved into comfortable, ergonomic shapes, but dense enough to hold heat longer than almost any other natural mineral. Artisans would carve soapstone into flat bricks or rounded ovals specifically designed for the bed. Because of its unique molecular structure, soapstone releases its heat at a steady, rhythmic decay. While a granite stone might be scorching at midnight and cold by 3 a.m., a soapstone brick provided a linear thermal discharge that could sustain the bed environment until the first grey light of dawn. This was time-released comfort, an engineering feat that turned the static mineral into a dynamic life support system. The ceramic pig, the fluid heat alternative. As the medieval period progressed, the solid stone was joined by the ceramic bottle, or the pig. This was a transition from mineral mass to liquid mass. These were heavy stoneware vessels, often shaped with a flat side to prevent them from rolling out of the bed, filled with boiling water. The ceramic pig utilized the latent heat of water. Water has a higher heat capacity than stone, meaning it can store more energy per pound. However, water also cools more rapidly. To manage this, the ceramic walls of the ceramic pig were made exceptionally thick, acting as a flow regulator for the heat. The vessel was corked with wax and wood, creating a pressurized thermal cell. The scent of the pig, a mixture of damp clay and earth, was a sensory signal that the metabolic cold of the linen had been defeated. This was passive control. By adding or removing a layer of cloth, the sleeper could tune the output of their stone.
In the atmospheric gloom of the bedchamber, the bundle of heat was tucked at the small of the back or against the femoral arteries of the inner thigh, where the blood flow is highest, allowing the stone's pulse to be carried throughout the entire body. The hot stone ritual, pre-sleep calibration. The hot stone ritual was not just about the moment of sleep, it was about preconditioning the environment. A half hour before the lord or lady retired, a servant would sweep the bed with a warming pan, the brass vessel discussed in Chapter 6, and then deposit the wrapped stones in the center of the mattress. This created a thermal core in the feathered sanctuary. By the time the sleeper climbed into the bed, the cold soak of the blankets had been evaporated. The humidity, the hidden thief of heat, was driven out of the linen, leaving the bed crisp and radiant. This manual pre-charge meant that the sleeper's internal metabolism didn't have to work to claim the space. The stone had already conquered the territory on their behalf.
The residual morning, the stone as a relic. In the absolute obscurity of the winter morning, the history of the stone reached its conclusion. As the inhabitant woke, they would find the stone was now lukewarm, a mineral ghost of the fire that had birthed it. The stone was not discarded, it was recycled. It was carried back to the great hall, where it would sit on the dais of the hearth to begin the cycle again. This circular economy of heat was the infinite loom of the castle's survival. The stone was the tangible link between the public fire and the private dream. It was a boring history of mineral utility, a manual transfer of survival that ensured the great stasis of the castle night was never absolute. The hot stone ritual was the final latch in the thermal chain, a reliable, rhythmic bridge that allowed the human heart to remain blood-warm even when the limestone reality of the world outside was frozen to the core. The capillary cloak, sealing the thermal chimney. In the modern era, we view the nightcap as a whimsical relic of a Dickensian past, but in the architectural reality of a medieval keep, it was an essential piece of cranial insulation. The human body is a thermogenic engine that prioritizes the brain above all other organs. To maintain the constant 37 degrees Celsius required for neurological function, the body directs a massive volume of blood to the scalp, a region with high vascularity and almost no subcutaneous fat. Without a capillary cloak, the head becomes a radiant leak, a thermal chimney that can vent up to 40% of a person's total body heat into the frigid air of the bedchamber. The physics of the cranial heat sink. To understand the necessity of the nightcap, one must visualize the atmospheric stratification of a castle room. While the celestial bed, discussed in Chapter 6, trapped a pocket of warmth around the torso, the head often remained exposed to the ambient air to ensure a supply of oxygen. In a room where the limestone reality had pulled the temperature down to near freezing, the delta between the skin of the scalp and the air was extreme. This created a convective loop. Warm blood would rise to the scalp, heat would be lost through the thin skin to the cold air, and the cooled blood would then return to the core, forcing the heart and metabolism to work harder to compensate. This is biological drain. By applying a textile seal to the head, the medieval sleeper arrested this process. The nightcap functioned as a thermal barrier, turning the scalp from a heat sink into a heat reservoir. The anatomy of the coif, the primary seal. The most common form of the nightcap was the coif. This was a tight-fitting, skull-hugging cap made of bleached linen or fine wool.
Unlike a loose-fitting modern beanie, the coif was designed to be mechanically integrated with the head. It featured long ties, stay strings, that were fastened under the chin. This secure fit was vital for two reasons. Vascular compression, the slight pressure of the coif, helped reduce the radiant surface area of the scalp's blood vessels. And stability. It ensured the cap remained in place throughout the rhythmic shifting of sleep, preventing the conductive shock that occurs when a warm head suddenly touches a cold pillow. For the American reader, the coif represents the first layer of defense. It was the linen membrane that managed the moisture of the scalp while providing a base layer of insulation that could be supplemented as the temperature dropped. The woolen hood, or chaperone, was a composite garment that covered the head, the ears, and crucially, the neck and shoulders. The neck is a high-volume thermal highway. The carotid arteries and jugular veins carry a massive amount of core heat close to the surface. By covering the neck with a thick wool gorget, the cape-like part of the hood, the medieval inhabitant was insulating the pipes. This prevented the blood from cooling on its way to the brain. The history of the hood is one of biological optimization, a realization that to keep the head warm, one must also protect the thermal bridge of the neck. The sovereign protection of the ears and sinuses. One of the most painful aspects of mineral cold is the effect on the peripheral cartilage. The ears, composed of thin tissue and lacking significant blood flow, are prone to astringent chilling, which can lead to agonizing earaches and disrupted sleep. The nightcap provided acoustic and thermal padding. By layering wool over the ears, the sleeper created a buffered environment for the inner ear. Furthermore, by keeping the forehead and sinuses warm, the cap prevented the crystalline condensation of mucus, which can lead to winter infections. This was proactive healthcare. The capillary cloak was not just about comfort, it was about maintaining the integrity of the respiratory and neurological systems during the great stasis of the night.
The psychological shield, obscurity and stillness. Beyond the mechanical benefits, the nightcap provided a psychological enclosure. In the absolute obscurity of a windowless keep, the feeling of a secure wrap around the head offered a sense of sensory safety. It muffled the acoustic chaos of the wind whistling through the battlements and the rhythmic creak of the timber rafters. This sensory deprivation was essential for deep restorative stasis. By narrowing the input range of the senses, the nightcap allowed the brain to withdraw from the environment. The person was no longer monitoring the cold, they were tucked into the fabric. The scent of the coif, usually lavender or clean flax, became a sonic and olfactory signal that the internal world was now the only one that mattered. The morning thaw, the ritual of unveiling. As the first muted light of morning filtered through the oiled parchment of the windows, to be discussed in Chapter 12, the capillary cloak reached the end of its nightly duty. The removal of the cap was a rhythmic transition back to the public life of the castle. The head, having been incubated for 8 hours, would release a plume of vapor into the cold morning air, a biological proof of the cap's efficiency. The cap itself was aired near the banked coals of the hearth, recharging it for the next nocturnal cycle. This manual management of head heat was the final latch in the sartorial defense. The infinite history of the medieval night is one of capped energy, a boring history of fibrous protection that turned the thermal chimney of the head into a sealed vault of warmth, ensuring that even when the limestone reality was at its most freezing and hostile, the human mind remained safe and blood-warm beneath its linen guard.
The communal huddle, the social physics of shared radiance. In the contemporary American experience, privacy is synonymous with comfort. We view the bedroom as a solitary fortress, a place where the individual or the couple retreats into a private sphere. However, in a medieval castle, privacy was not a luxury, it was a thermal liability. To sleep alone was to surrender to the cold soak of the masonry. Instead, medieval society operated on the principle of interspecies and interpersonal symbiosis. This was the era of the communal huddle, a strategic pooling of biological energy that turned the household into a multi-organism heat engine. The thermodynamics of the group. The fundamental physics of the huddle rely on the surface area to volume ratio. A single human body exposed to the astringent drafts of a great hall loses heat through every square inch of its skin. However, when 4 people press together under a single massive woolen mantle, the effective surface area exposed to the cold is drastically reduced. This is shared metabolic efficiency. The core heat of one person radiates into the peripheral tissue of the next. In the atmospheric gloom of the night, the group functions as a single biological unit. For the medieval mind, the physical proximity of others was the most reliable thermal constant. It was a live energy grid that didn't require a hearth or a stone. It only required the steady pulse of a neighbor. The hierarchy of the huddle, the great hall floor. In the great hall, the huddle was a social necessity. Below the salt, where the servants, laborers, and transient guards slept, there were no celestial beds, as described in Chapter 6. These individuals relied on the respiration of the collective. They would arrange themselves in a rhythmic pattern across the reed and rush meadow, discussed in Chapter 4. Often they slept in a spoke arrangement around the dais of the hearth. By lying with their feet toward the embers and their bodies pressed side to side, they created a human wall against the conductive reality of the floor. The scent of the huddle, a mixture of damp wool, wood smoke, and communal breath, was the olfactory proof of safety. This was not a sign of poverty, but a manual calibration of survival. The bedfellow, the professionalism of proximity. Even among the aristocracy, the individual mattress was a rarity. The concept of the bedfellow was a formal social and thermal arrangement. A lord might sleep with his most trusted advisor, or a lady with her ladies-in-waiting. This was strategic heat sharing. By sharing a feather tick, the occupants ensured that the air volume within the bed curtains remained at a metabolic peak. The bedfellow provided a constant radiant anchor. If one person moved, the heat they had generated remained in the fibrous matrix of the bedding for the other. This interlocking reciprocity turned the history of sleep into a diplomatic exchange of calories. It was a boring history of thermal utility, where the social bond was forged in the shared respiration of the winter night.
The interspecies matrix. Dogs as thermal buffers. As explored in Chapter 8, the canine furnace was an integral part of the communal huddle. In the deep freeze, the distinction between human space and animal space dissolved. Large hounds were encouraged to interleave with the human sleepers. The dog served as a biological buffer zone. Positioned at the edges of the huddle, the dogs took the brunt of the atmospheric chilling, protecting the human core of the group. In return, the dogs benefited from the atmospheric protection of the humans' heavy wool cloaks. This interspecies symbiosis was the final latch in the thermal chain. The dog's high-octane metabolism acted as a supplementary heat pump, injecting extra energy into the human microclimate. The psychological security of the pulse. Beyond the mechanical transfer of heat, the communal huddle provided neurological stability. In the absolute obscurity of a castle at midnight, where the only sounds were the whistle of the wind and the rhythmic creak of the rafters, the tactile assurance of a neighbor's heartbeat was a sovereign comfort.
This sensory integration reduced the stress response of the body. A person who feels safe and warm enters a deep restorative stasis more quickly, which in turn allows the body to conserve glucose and maintain a higher internal temperature. The huddle was a feedback loop of comfort. By reducing the anxiety of the void, the group ensured that every member's metabolic output was maximized for maintenance rather than emergency thermogenesis. The morning separation, breaking the grid. As the muted light of the morning began to thaw the atmosphere, the huddle would rhythmically disintegrate. The breaking of the huddle was a sartorial transition back to individual identity. The residual heat left behind in the straw and wool was a transient relic of the night's success. The inhabitants would emerge from the common shell of the huddle, charged with the collective energy of the group. This manual management of social heat was the infinite history of the medieval castle, a realization that the human heart is the most potent thermal resource available. The communal huddle was the final victory over the limestone reality. It turned the hostile mineral keep into a hospitable human landscape, proving that in the great stasis of the winter, the shared pulse was the only metronome of survival that truly mattered. The window's shield, horn, parchment, and the heavy shutter. In the architectural vocabulary of the modern American home, a window is a portal of transparency, a thin, clear membrane designed to invite the outside world in while maintaining a perfect thermal seal. In the mineral reality of a medieval keep, a window was a literal wind eye, eggethyril, a puncture in the limestone battery that threatened to drain the castle's caloric reservoir in a single gust. To manage this, medieval builders and inhabitants created a tiered defensive system for their apertures. They utilized a combination of biological membranes and mechanical barriers to filter light without surrendering to the astringent night air. The physics of the aperture, the arrow slit and the splay. To understand the atmospheric protection of a castle window, one must first look at its geometry. Unlike the wide, expansive glass of today, medieval windows in the exterior curtain walls were often arrow slits or narrow lancets. These were designed with an extreme interior splay. The physics of the splay served a dual purpose. On the exterior, the opening was a mere sliver, sometimes only 4 inches wide, minimizing the surface area exposed to the glacial advance of the wind. On the interior, the masonry flared outward at an angle, allowing the muted light of the Arctic or northern sky to bounce off the whitewashed limestone and illuminate the room. This geometric filter ensured that the pressure differential between the cold exterior and the warm interior was kept to a minimum. The window was not an opening, it was a light funnel that prioritized structural integrity over visual clarity. The oiled parchment, the translucent seal. Because glass was an extravagant luxury, often reserved for cathedrals or the highest royal chambers, the standard medieval pane was a processed biological membrane. The most common material was oiled parchment or vellum. This was a manual transformation of animal skin. Calves or sheepskin were scraped thin until it reached a state of translucent purity and then treated with linseed oil. This oil saturation served 2 critical functions. Waterproofing. It made the skin hydrophobic, ensuring that rain and sleet would bead off rather than soaking into the fiber and causing it to rot. Light transmission. The oil filled the microscopic voids between the skin's fibers, allowing light to pass through with a soft, diffuse glow.
The atmosphere of the room behind an oiled parchment window was sepia-toned and golden. It lacked the sharp reality of glass, but it provided a soft visual warmth that made the freezing stone feel more hospitable. For the inhabitant, the parchment shield was the first filter, a flexible barrier that breathed slightly with the atmospheric pressure but refused to let the liquid cold penetrate the stone cocoon. The horn plate, the plastic of the Middle Ages. For a more durable transparency, the medieval craftsman turned to the horn plate. This was the history of biological plastic. By boiling the horns of cattle, artisans could soften the keratin until it became malleable. The horn was then sliced into paper-thin sheets and flattened under heavy stone presses. These keratin panes were then stitched together with fine lead or wooden strips into a lattice called a fenstrel. The horn was impervious to the wind and far tougher than parchment. It didn't flutter in a gale. Instead, it provided a static guard. The light passing through horn was amber and textured, often showing the natural grain of the animal's growth. This biological shield was the high-performance version of the windowsill, a manual calibration of light that turned the astringent night into a subdued glow. The heavy oak shutter, the mechanical full stop. When the sun set and the atmospheric clarity of the day vanished, the biological membranes were no longer sufficient. The castle then entered its nocturnal lockdown. This was the rhythm of the shutter. Every window was equipped with a massive oak shutter, often 3 inches thick and reinforced with wrought iron straps. These were not decorative, they were atmospheric valves. When the shutters were closed and barred with a heavy drop bolt, the window effectively ceased to exist. The castle became a sealed box. The physics of the closed shutter involved the creation of a secondary dead air pocket. Between the parchment pane and the oak shutter, a buffer zone of air was trapped. This composite insulation was the final latch in the castle's thermal defense. The acoustic proof of the shutter's success was the muffling of the gale, the transition from the whistle of the wind to a low, distant thrum. Inside the stone cocoon, the great stasis was achieved through the mechanical deletion of the exterior world. The scent of the lockdown and the internal climate. The closing of the shutters triggered a change in the internal respiration of the room. With the exhaust vents of the windows sealed, the soapstone hearth, discussed in Chapter 5, and the shared radiance of the communal huddle, Chapter 11, became the absolute masters of the environment. The air became heavy and oily, thick with the scent of the lockdown, a mixture of lanolin, wood smoke, tallow, and banked embers. This atmospheric density was a sensory comfort. It felt solid. For the medieval sleeper, the visual obscurity provided by the oak shutter was a physiological necessity. It allowed the brain to withdraw from the horizon and focus entirely on the sovereign protection of the bed curtains. The window was no longer a wind eye, it was a healed wound in the masonry, a static point in the geometry of survival. The morning opening, the rhythmic return of the sky. As the muted light of the dawn pressed against the shutters, the rhythm of the unbarring began. Opening the shutters was an atmospheric event. A plume of warm, stale air would rush out, and a knife of cold Arctic light would slice into the room. This was the reoxygenation of the stone cocoon. The inhabitants would scan the horizon through the oiled parchment, checking for the atmospheric clarity of a clear day or the heavy grey of a coming storm.
This rhythmic interaction with the window was the metronome of the castle, a manual negotiation with the mineral reality that ensured the human heart remained blood-warm behind its horn and oak guard, waiting for the infinite history of the winter to finally thaw into spring. The piment and posset, internal combustion through diet. While the stone cocoon of the castle provided a structural defense and the linen layers offered a sartorial shield, the most critical engine of survival was the internal furnace of the human body. In the grueling sub-zero reality of a medieval winter, warmth was not just something you sought, it was something you manufactured through the chemical breakdown of nutrients. The medieval diet was a sophisticated system of thermal fueling, a metabolic strategy designed to provide the body with the high caloric density and thermogenic properties required to maintain a core temperature. The physics of the caloric burn. To survive a night in a limestone keep where the ambient temperature might linger near freezing, the human body must engage in thermogenesis. This is a high-energy process that requires a constant supply of biological fuel. For the medieval inhabitant, food was viewed through a functional lens. It was the coal for the internal engine.
The diet of the winter months was characterized by lipid density. Fats, whether derived from animal lard, butter or oil, contain more than double the energy per gram than carbohydrates or proteins. This made fat the premium fuel for the great stasis. By consuming high-fat pottages, thick stews of legumes, grains and fatty pork, the medieval person ensured a slow-release energy source that would fuel their biological radiance for the 12 hours of darkness. This was metabolic engineering. The stomach became a combustion chamber where the energy of the summer harvest was converted into the radiant pulse of the winter night. The piment, the spiced catalysts of warmth. Among the elite, the internal combustion was assisted by piment, a highly sophisticated aromatic wine. Piment was not merely a drink, it was a thermogenic infusion. It consisted of wine sweetened with honey and fortified with a pharmacopoeia of heat-inducing spices, including ginger, cinnamon, cloves, and long pepper. The physiology of spices played a crucial role in perceived warmth. Ingredients like ginger and pepper contain compounds that trigger vasodilation, the widening of blood vessels. When consumed, these spices encourage the blood to flow more freely to the peripheral tissues and the skin, creating a sensation of radiant glow. Furthermore, these spices acted as metabolic stimulants, slightly increasing the basalt respiration of the body's cells. A goblet of piment before bed served as a liquid catalyst, priming the body's chemical furnace before the sartorial lockdown of the bed curtains. The posset, the nightly caloric anchor. For the average inhabitant and the aristocracy alike, the posset was the ultimate latch of the day's nutrition. A posset was a hot, curdled beverage made of milk curdled with ale or wine, often sweetened and spiced. This was the ultimate sleep fuel. The combination of protein from the milk curds and fast-acting sugars from the honey or ale provided an immediate thermal spike, while the complex fats in the dairy provided the long burn endurance needed for the night. The scent of the posset, a mixture of boiled cream and spiced yeast, was the olfactory signal for the body to transition into restorative stasis. In the atmospheric gloom of the bedchamber, the act of drinking the warmth was a ritual of internal priming, ensuring the biological engine had enough pressure to last until the morning. The pottage, the slow-burning log of the stomach. The mainstay of the medieval winter was pottage, a thick porridge-like stew that simmered over the centralized hearth, discussed in Chapter 3, for days. This was energy consolidation.
By cooking grains like barley or oats for extended periods, the starch matrix was broken down into a highly bioavailable form of energy. The pottage functioned as the slow-burning log of the internal fire. Unlike modern refined sugars that provide a thermal flash followed by a cold crash, the complex carbohydrates and fibers of the pottage provided a linear discharge of glucose. This ensured that the metabolic metronome of the sleeper remained steady. For the American reader, imagine the pottage as a battery pack that you consume, a nutritional foundation that turns the internal body into a heat-retentive core as solid as the limestone walls themselves. The sovereign preservation of animal fats. In the deep freeze of midwinter, lard, suet, and marrow were the thermal gold of the kitchen. Marrow, in particular, was sought after for its extreme caloric concentration. The manual extraction of marrow, the rhythmic scrape of the knife against the bone, was a biological necessity. Marrow is almost pure high-density energy. When added to a posset or spread on a coarse rye crust, it provided the thermal lubrication for the body's oxidative processes. This lipid shield not only fueled the heart, but also provided the insulating layer of subcutaneous fat that helped arrest the loss of heat to the mineral environment. The medieval diet was a history of fat, a realization that the human heart is only as warm as the fuel it consumes. The morning thaw, reigniting the engine. As the muted light of dawn signaled the end of the nocturnal cycle, the first priority of the household was reignition. The morning draught of warm ale and hard bread served as the bellows for the internal fire. The atmospheric clarity of the morning was met with a thermal reinforcement. The inhabitants would recharge their chemical systems, preparing for the manual labor of the day. This rhythmic refueling was the infinite history of the medieval castle, a boring history of nutritional logistics that turned the internal body into a heat-retentive core as solid as the limestone walls themselves.
The vertical draft, managing the thermal chimney. In the structural anatomy of a castle, the greatest enemy of a stable climate was not the thickness of the stone, but the geometry of movement. Because heat is inherently buoyant, a principle of physics known as the stack effect, a medieval keep functioned like a giant chimney. Any vertical opening, such as a well shaft or a staircase, threatened to suck the painstakingly cultivated, pooled warmth from the living quarters and vent it into the cold rafters or out through the battlements. To prevent this atmospheric hemorrhage, the castle's inhabitants utilized a series of thermal valves and mechanical baffles designed to break the vertical flow of air. The physics of the spiral staircase. The iconic spiral staircase of the medieval fortress was a masterpiece of military defense, but a nightmare for thermal retention. Its narrow, corkscrew design created a vortex effect. Cold, dense air from the lower damp-proof courses would push upward, while the warm air of the great hall would be drawn into the stairwell to replace it. To counter this siphon of heat, builders employed directional choking. The staircases were often designed with heavy oak doors at both the base and the summit. These were not merely for security against invaders, they were atmospheric regulators. By keeping these doors latched and bolted, the inhabitants created a pressurized chamber within the stairwell. The air inside the stairwell became a stagnant buffer, prevented from mixing with the microclimates of the solas or the sleeping chambers. The leather membrane, the high-performance seal. In the high-traffic areas where a heavy oak door was impractical, the medieval steward relied on the leather portiere. These were massive curtains made of treated cowhide or heavy waxed wool hung across the entrances to the stairwells and corridors. Leather was the high-performance seal of the era.
Its density and weight ensured that it hung perfectly vertical even when a pressure differential tried to push air past it. When a person moved through the curtain, the lever would snap back into place with a muffled thud, instantly resealing the room. This was manual air locking. The leather acted as a valve, allowing humans to pass through while arresting the velocity of the draft. For the American reader, envision this as the medieval version of a strip curtain in a commercial freezer, a tactile shield that prioritized atmospheric integrity over ease of access. The sovereign ceiling, managing the great void. In the Great Hall, where the ceiling might be 40 feet above the floor, the stack effect was at its most dangerous. To prevent the total loss of heat to the roof timbers, the inhabitants used internal canopies. They would hang horizontal cloth ceilings or testers made of linen or wool over specific areas, such as the high table or the communal huddle discussed in Chapter 11. This was volumetric redaction. By creating a secondary ceiling at a lower height, they effectively short-circuited the chimney effect. The heat from the centralized hearth would hit the fabric and bloom outward rather than rising into the inaccessible void. This textile engineering turned a cavernous space into a hospitable pocket, ensuring that the biological radiance of the people remained within the human zone. The acoustic guard of the draft break. Managing the vertical draft also had a profound effect on the acoustic atmosphere of the castle. An open stairwell acts as a sound pipe, carrying the iron clatter of the armory or the barking of hounds from the courtyard into the private sanctuary of the bedchamber. By sealing the vertical shafts with leather and wood, the medieval inhabitant created an acoustic stasis. The muffling of sound was a sensory indicator of warmth. A silent room felt thermally stable. The rhythmic creak of the leather curtain and the solid click of the stair door were sonic signals that the internal world was protected. This sensory lockdown allowed the brain to enter a state of profound relaxation, knowing that the astringent night had no avenue of entry. The chimney effect in reverse, summer ventilation. It is worth noting that the vertical draft was a double-edged tool. In the height of summer, the stack effect was intentionally unleashed. By opening the doors at the base of the keep and the louvers in the roof, the medieval inhabitants used the chimney physics to exhale the heat of the day. This was passive air conditioning. The mineral mass of the castle would cool the incoming air, and the vertical draft would pull the warm, stale air upward and out. This atmospheric versatility was the hallmark of the medieval keep. It was a machine for living, a structure that could be throttled in the winter to trap the heat and opened in the summer to invite the breeze. The infinite history of the castle is one of manual modulation, a history of pressure and flow that ensured the human heart remained blood-warm through the great stasis of the winter.
The spring awakening, the thaw of the stone. As the metronome of the seasons finally shifts toward the vernal equinox, the medieval castle undergoes a profound physical metamorphosis. The transition from the great stasis of winter to the vitality of spring is not merely a change in the weather, it is a molecular reset for the building itself. The stone cocoon, which for months has acted as a static shield, begins to breathe again. This final chapter explores the rhythmic unfolding of the castle household as the limestone reality thaws and the biological microclimates of the interior merge once more with the atmospheric freedom of the outside world. The reversal of the thermal flow. The most significant event of the spring is the thermal inversion of the masonry. Throughout the winter, the heat flow was unidirectional, from the human core outward into the mineral sinks.
As the exterior air temperature rises and the sun strikes the battlements with renewed kinetic energy, the stones begin to absorb warmth from the outside. This is the waking of the battery. The cold soak that had saturated the 5-foot-thick walls for months is slowly neutralized. The radiant chill that previously leached the warmth from the tapestry membrane, discussed in Chapter 2, begins to dissipate. The inhabitants notice a softening of the atmosphere. The air inside the keep no longer feels astringent or brittle. Instead, it carries the damp promise of the defrosting earth. The castle is no longer a container for heat. It is becoming a regulator of the breeze. The great stripping, deconstructing the cocoon. The spring awakening is marked by a ritual of deconstruction. The sartorial and architectural layers that were essential for survival are now redacted. The removal of the rushes, the reed and rush meadow, which has acted as a biological floor heater, is raked up and carried to the fields as fertilizer. This cleansing of the foundation removes the olfactory archive of the winter. The storage of the furs, the heavy mantles and pellices are brushed, aired in the sun, and packed into cedar and lavender chests. This weight reduction changes the rhythmic movement of the household, returning a sense of agility to the household. The opening of the shutter, the mechanical full stop of the oak shutters is abandoned. They are thrown wide, allowing unfiltered sunlight to strike the limestone floors for the first time in months. The atmospheric reoxygenation of the keep. With the vertical drafts no longer being choked and the windows open, the castle's respiration changes from shallow and conserved to deep and expansive. The scent of the lockdown, that thick mixture of tallow, wood smoke, and banked embers, is replaced by the floral radiance of the blooming valley. This atmospheric flush is vital for the sanitary integrity of the keep. The movement of fresh, moving air dries out the residual damp that accumulated behind the tapestries and in the rubble core of the walls. The microclimates of the solars and celestial beds, Chapter 6, dissolve as the temperature becomes uniform and hospitable throughout the entire structure. The sovereign protection of the huddle is no longer required. The individual can once again exist in the open space. The return to the courtyard, expanding the social horizon. As the internal combustion of the piment and posset is replaced by the fresh greens of the first harvest, the social geography of the castle expands. The communal huddle migrates from the hearthside to the sun-drenched baileys and garden enclosures. Life is no longer compressed into the architecture of the pocket. The inhabitants rediscover the vastness of their domain. The infinite history of the winter, a tale of manual calibration and passive engineering, becomes a memory of resilience. The stone cocoon has done its duty. It has carried the human heart through the absolute zero of the night and delivered it safely to the rhythmic return of the sun. The great stasis has broken, and the metronome of the castle begins to beat with the vibrant pulse of the spring.
That is where the true spirit of how did medieval people sleep in freezing stone castle rests. And as we close tonight's story, I want to thank you for being here, for listening, and for keeping these histories alive. If you've enjoyed this journey through time, consider subscribe, like, comment, and share, where we continue to explore the stories, traditions, and mysteries behind the celebrations that shape our world. Your support helps keep the lantern burning, illuminating the past so that its warmth can reach the present. Until next time, may your nights be peaceful, your hearths bright, and your heart filled with gratitude. and I pray for your success and abundance. Good night.